Alright, so this is my process when I'm making a map. It's not anything particularly awesome. I know a couple of keyboard shortcuts, which makes it easier to use it. If you don't recognize it, this is Inkarnate. They recently came out with a beta to make just battle maps instead of their usual regional and world maps, so I gave it a try because I was already making regional maps there and I ended up really liking it. The grid here itself, the grid tool could use a little bit of work, so you basically get to the size you want, and when you need to export to somewhere else, either you got really lucky and chose one of the few grid sizes that lets you just easily export, or you're going to have to Photoshop and crop it a bit so that it fits properly. Now, onto the map I'm making itself. We are going to be making a underground dungeon that leads to a frozen clearing and eventually a stairway up into a magical tower. This is sort of the first half of an adventure that I'm running, and I want there to be 3 main paths. So the first path I'm building is the most difficult, and it is a complex set of mazes and traps on the bottom left side of the map. Now this in itself has a 3-path option to it as well, and while people can, sure, jump around and do whatever they like, the truth is they're gonna just pretty much follow the straightaways and make it as easy as possible. Now what you might be wondering to yourself is, what are you doing putting all these rocks down? Why aren't you using rock walls or something else like that? Well, when I'm building unfinished walls like this, in unfinished locations, I like to make it look like it's unfinished. And while, yes, it's kind of overkill to do all this rock stuff, and I think in the future I would do more copy pasting and group work, this is giving me a very nice chaotic look. You can tell that this corner of the map is not built out, is not lived in, and is somewhat dangerous. Next thing you're seeing here, I'm just going to turn everything into foreground. In general, this is what I usually start with my maps, but not all the time. I'm also going to add a couple of floor textures here and there, just to give a general sense of where everything's going to be. I like to have spacing just work out of my mind. Also, what you just saw there was that I changed the size of the texture. I think it's a good idea to always put down 2 different sizes of the same texture in the same area with about 30%, 40% opacity. This is going to give you a layering effect that's going to look really, really nice in the long run, and it's very little effort to make that. So essentially you'll have big versions and small versions of the same texture, so the layering effect that has makes it look like you're on big pounds of dirt, as well as very detailed little sections without too much repeat or overlap. And again, that's because every time you put down a material, you're going to want to have it at a very low opacity. I usually stick to around 30 or 40%. Unless it's the domineering effect of the world, hence the ground or the snow, then maybe you'll jump it up to 70 or 80. So again, I'm just building all the walls out of small rocks right now. If you're curious about the spacing, I found that if I put rocks into the corners that they were supposed to go for every wall as it connected, it made it easier to just sort of place one after the other in a row, so it felt a little more randomized. I also set it so that every rock I put down is at a random angle, and it randomly selects out of the pile of rocks, which means occasionally you'll have a big rock jutting in the wrong direction, but in the grand scheme of things, these little mistakes are easily ignored by players, and it's not worth your time to go back and nitpick all that stuff to death. Trust me, this whole thing, even though the video is only 22 minutes long, took me about, I want to say 2.5 hours, maybe 2 hours and 45 minutes, so if you sweat the small stuff, especially early on, it's going to kill you. And I'm already noticing, as I'm watching myself right now, I'm sweating a lot of small stuff. One thing too that you may notice during the video, but I don't draw too much attention to, is the fact that I was a little bit off with the spacing from my original map to what I was doing here. I'm not sure how I added an extra 2 grids, but I did at some point. Luckily, I had enough space elsewhere that I was able to compensate, but it is worth pointing out that I think next time I was to do something like this, I would use the pathing tool to draw out all my walls where I want them to be, and then later on I could just select only the paths, and then just select the whole map and delete them. That way I wouldn't have to sort of guess and check all my work here with all my walls, especially considering I'm using a unique way to build these walls out as opposed to just the standard wall tile sets that they have here. While I'm still building out walls, I'd like to point out that I do have a subscription to Inkarnate. I felt like it was 100% worth it. The amount of stuff that they give you and the amount of regular updates, it's really actually kind of shocking how day and night my Inkarnate experience has been over the past, I want to say a year almost now. Essentially when I started, it was just, some regional maps and some world map stuff, and it was really great. It had a lot of features to it. I subscribed purely out of the essence that I had used it enough that they deserve some cash for it. That's how I see things, at least. And over the past 4 or 5 months, they added in this battle map feature. They've been regularly updating with temples, churches, cathedrals. There's a train section they just added now, so it's very clear that the devs are still working on this with their team, and they have regular map challenges. All right, we're gonna jump off the Inkarnate bandwagon, and you might be wondering, why are you making walls when before you were doing rocks? Well, it's nice to show that there's a transition between and a difference from two locations. And while that was a very jagged, rocky, dangerous sort of area earlier in the map, up here we're drawing the quote-unquote civilized sectors. Essentially, this is where the ice orcs, or whatever you would put in this area, actually colonize the cave system. And this is where they like to stay, store their stuff, take naps, put guards on duty, that sort of thing. So I'm just building out the walls right now, and already I can tell that this is not the most efficient way I've ever built walls before, but hey, no one's perfect, and sometimes these things get away from you. Now, something I did with this map a lot, which I don't do a ton with my other maps, but it's starting to grow on me just a little bit, is putting more space between sectors that I'm going to. Normally my rooms are just back to back, corner to corner, with only a single wall between them. But I think if you put this type of spacing, it's good both visually for the player so that they know they're not missing anything, or that there's potential hidden walls or traps in there. And it also means that if later on you mess up and you run out of space, you can always cannibalize a few extra tiles and you'll be good to go. Especially if you come up with a cool idea on the fly that you'd like to fix. Now what you see I'm doing here is this middle section. I want to give the appearance that it's somewhat built in, but also definitely held by the wild. Hence the rocks that are smoother on top of the already smooth wall. Especially how it tapers off from the entrance to the cave to the more interior, which would be probably built out more so. Here I am, just putting a couple more walls in, a couple of rooms here and there. At this point, I knew that I was definitely off of my tile set a bit, but I just kept on going and figured, hey, you know, it can't be that bad. And this time it ended up being really good, but I think at this point, what I should have done is I should have taken a pause, counted my tiles from top to bottom, left to right, at a few key points, and then figure out what I'd messed up. This time I got very lucky, but in the future that could cause some serious issues, or it could just make it visually unappealing in the long run. So make sure to count your tiles and check out where your key entry points, exit points, and room barriers are. Counting to where doors are supposed to be located is a great way in order to tell what you're doing. Also, what you might be seeing a lot of is copying and pasting longer sections of the wall. I find it's a lot easier to just add more sections of the wall by copy pasting, then flipping the texture, or maybe rotating it 180 degrees. It's good not to put too much of the same copy and paste next to one another. So the left section of this map and the center section are mostly an underground cave system. In terms of the canon of my world, this whole area was built out by a set of ice orcs years back that were just sick of being slaughtered by the humanoid races. And eventually, they were contracted to build an enormous magical tower with the help of the most dominant nation at the time. Unfortunately, it failed, and now it's causing a bunch of magical garbage to spew all over the world, so they have to have an active team here in this area. So the cave system is something of a way of keeping out wild beasts and just the average happenstance person coming along, and if they were to make it through a set of traps, triggers, and whatnot, they eventually make it into the courtyard where there is a small army base positioned here. Now, is there a lot of people? Absolutely not. It would be extremely not cost effective to have just a ton of warriors on standby at a tower that rarely actually attacks anybody in the area. However, lately the monsters have been getting a little bit more dangerous and a little bit more out there, so, you know, gotta have that extra guard. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm using the shadow brush tool. The shadow brush tool is one of my favorite ones to use. Anytime you have an object that's taller than the area it's standing around, especially these cliffs or that walkway at the bottom section there, you want to put a little bit of shadow along the edge. Alright, here I'm just touching up. I'm turning the center section into an underground water basin. I'm creating a couple of deeper ends with the darker blues. Remember, water is always lighter when it's shallower, so make the deep areas nice and dark. Also there, I'm layering out the sand or the dirt that's out there, so make it heavy, closer to the coast, and then make it lighter towards the edge. Again, 30% with brush tools. And then I'm adding in the cobblestone walkways. This was a very ancient way to have paths that was easy to design, build, and implement, and so I use it a lot for citizens in countries that don't have a huge amount of development, but, you know, aren't savages either. Now this bottom left section is kind of a meme section, you can almost call it. It's not actually a meme, I promise. It's kind of like a trickster god who likes to do game shows back then. So occasionally I have him quiz my players on 5e stuff, and this is my first attempt building a stage, so what I ended up doing was giving the classic wooden slats for the stage, because most stages are built that way in the worlds, and people would recognize it as that. And then I just put a stone railing around it to just signify its endpoint. While I'm having the brush tool out, I take out the snow tool and make the valley section more apparent that it's outside, and I just kind of do some outlining so that I can keep it in mind and what I want to do next and the next steps there. Alright, so when it comes to putting textures down, especially when you have something that's very gritty, it's sometimes a good idea to use the select space tool up at the top instead of just using the circular brush tool or the one that has the curved edges. If you set a specific location, then you just place it all down, that works best. Okay, now we're building a small encampment. To build a small encampment, it's pretty easy. You put up the type of housing you want to have, either temporary or permanent. Usually you want to have some sort of fire source or a water source, considering their water source normally comes from underground cave stalagmites and stalactites. That was unnecessary here. Now at this point I attempted to put low opacity rocks to make it look like there's an overhang, but that clearly didn't work, so I'm going to have to use the ground to give off that look instead. So I had a lot more dirt, especially around where the fire is and all the paths people would take. So you see me making a lot of paths from the fire to their front door, and then the path to the outside area where they do the rest of their business. Again, I'm layering with 2 different sizes of the same texture. This gives it a lot of depth to it, and it makes it so that the repeating details aren't too obvious. A little more cleanup, the section up there, making sure there are roads. Here I want to add a big tree, so I put that there, and then I find couple of trees that I tried to put over the opacity, but it didn't work, so I found the snow top and made that the only type of tree up there. And I changed the opacity to about 0.25%, and that's going to tell people that's there, but it's not physically in the way, so they can hide around the trunk, but they're not going to be taking up that entire space. A couple of training dummies, because what army base doesn't, and then here's a little shack. So they're going to need food on command, especially this being the wintertime and everything, so I'm setting up kind of a little animal farm barn sort of thing. Just put up a couple of wooden walls, and darken the background area. We're going to end up making that floor a little darker, and a few more paths here too. To the stairwell around the training camp, into the training dummies, because remember they're going to fire arrows, so they'll walk back and forth from it. A couple of extra snowy trees to sort of make the place look a little prettier, and to give cover for future encounters. I just opened up a cave on the bottom section there too. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then we're going to put some logs for some people to sit on, one important one for a chieftain to make him stand out. And now here are the doors. Doors are one of the things I put on after I finally put all the walls up usually. And that's because doors are where everything's important. It's where most of the action usually ends up focusing on, and it's a focal point for players whenever they enter a room. So doors are a good decision. And then here's just a quick little makeshift shack. They have versions of shacks that you can just put right on there, but I'm not a huge fan. Then I just add a couple of things here, a few papers, an ink and quill, stuff that will draw the player's attention, and then a bowl here with, you know, some apples, which are part of a clue, essentially. If anyone stands in the center without food in their hands, they're in trouble. And that item right there I just put down as a plate. I figured it looked a little bit like a pressure pad or some sort of pedestal, so you make what you can with the materials that are given. Ooh, the skeleton tool. I love using the skeleton brush. It's always good to remember to keep the opacity at like 60% max with that one. Alright, and then I'll put some meat on a barrel there, make it look like a trap, add some bones around it, add some bones where the traps are down there. You know, you want to visually clue in your players what they're going to be challenging, otherwise they might feel a little cheapskated when traps just come out of the darkness. Alright, now making living spaces. So we got some storage racks in a couple of places where a guard's going to sit, where his food's going to go. So that, again, you know, build a world that people are living in, because if people aren't living there, why are they defending it? That's kind of the important piece. Now this is just a magical trap section. If you don't know where you're going or what you're going to be up against and you don't say a special word, these ice sculptures will form into monsters. Or maybe players can just do an Aladdin sort of thing where if they touch any of the gold or the treasures in here, it gets really bad for them. Or maybe somebody's in there that you want to talk to. That's why you want to be not too specific when you're building these types of rooms. Yes, some of my spaces are very specific, but some of them like that can be used multiple ways. So adding a couple of pedestals here. I'm building 3 of these types of altars, so I want them to really stand out visually. And this is also a duo trap source scenario where if you pour water on the fire, things go bad, but you can reach into the fire, pull stuff out, and then once you put your hands in the water, they heal immediately. So it's sort of like a twist on a normal scenario that people would go with things. And if they think out of the box and do a little bit of analysis, they'll immediately know what to do. But some people like to jump in head first, and I like to punish them for it. And I think that's more than fair. It's good to remind people that proper planning is the best way to go. Bit of spacing. Also, they have pedestals, which was awesome. I did not realize they had that. That must have been new. Throw a stone table in there with a prize of some kind. What should the prize be? I'm not really sure. Ooh, maybe we should go with a fishing pole, perhaps. Yeah, I'm going to make that a weird item. Then a bit of gold, too, obviously, because they deserve it if they win the prize in the game. This is going to be just a whole talk show fun thing. A couple of ruined curtains, because every stage should have a curtain. Mess with their colors, flip them around a little bit so that they don't match entirely, and then boom, you got something that's pretty flashy. Something that looks like an actual game show setting almost. But I did make a mistake. There are too many lights here. We'll fix that in a minute, I know. Ruined carpet for a little bit of extra effect. Remember, you don't want to overblow the work that you're doing, but you don't want to underblow it either. So I brought a copy of that torch in, made it a little bit smaller. Then I've got these carpets overlapping each other, making sure that they're not unaligned. So that's going to have a real regal entrance with another focal point at the end of it for people to see. And that's going to help draw their attention while also distracting them from potential monsters and dangers around them. Because that's the thing too, you're not just here to help people and show them something pretty to look at, you also need to be functional to a certain degree. Throw in a couple of statues in this space, make the regal look, add some glass, so that people can see down into the wintry abyss, which will clue them in to go down there if they need to do some more quests. Add a few stairs so that they're moving up. And yes, I know the stairs on here are not obvious whether or not they go up or down. So the bushes we had before, we had to get rid of them because we didn't realize that there was a snow option. So we got that fixed, again with the angle randomized so that the trees don't look too similar despite the fact they are the exact same stamp. And a few more items here and there, something on the floor to make the room a little bit more visually interesting. Over here, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, so I just added some more rocks to make it feel like an earthy, natural sort of space instead of an intentionally distracting area. Plus, again, this gives you more options for the future. Maybe you could have rock monsters in there next time. Then a general dirt path of what people follow most, because just like actual trailblazing in the wild, a natural path will eventually form if it's traveled most often. And walking through a cave system, you're going to track dirt around, so sometimes it's not a bad idea to put a general pathway. Alright, a couple of torches to give natural light sources, and also as a extra arm in terms of places of interest that the players should look or check out. Couple of extra loose bottles around, maybe it looks like somebody slacks off in this room or drinks too much in here. Something, you know, again, it doesn't need a full explanation and it doesn't need to be explained in the moment, but that sort of stuff can be really fun for players and it gives DMs a lot of options. Alright, so a ruined staircase there, fitting with the motif we've been going for. I'm going to try a few bushes, but if it doesn't have that snow texture on it right, it's not worth it, so we're going to move on from that. So at this point, we're adding the second layer of brush tool or texturing, which is just the snow texture, those little dots that you see. Again, all low opacity. Right now we're at 0.33. A couple more trap things we're putting in here. A dangerous well. A couple of spider webs we're going to start playing with, because honestly, I hadn't seen it before. So again, thank you so much, Inkarnate, for giving this to me. And as you can see here too, the way that I'm going to start putting webs down, the rightmost path has almost no webs, the leftmost path has a shitload of webs, and the center path is kind of in the middle. And webs are a sign that there is physical danger in the area, because that's where a bunch of bodies are found and wounded bodies are captured. Also, this big opening is kind of where spiders like to watch the shows whenever they happen, so it plays into the lore of it. Plus, you know, you're going through a deep, dark dungeon, there's going to be some spider webs. If you ask me, I should have put more in other places, less noticeable, but I don't like to overplay the whole spider gross thing with these places. I still hate spider enemies in almost every game. treasure chests are a good idea to put, especially around traps, especially if you want to throw some mimics their way. I also would have thrown in a few more corpses if I was to do this again, but hey, nobody's perfect, and it was running on 2 hours and 45 minutes, so sometimes you just need to decide when a map is done. And if you ever want to, you can come back to it and fix it up later. But sometimes the players can deal with it. Couple more traps here, big scythe. I gotta move the wall around just a little bit so that it can slide and swing perfectly. Obviously it's not actually animated to do that, but hey, you know what? The players can fill that in themselves. A ghostly furnace that's very ominous looking, gives me a couple options again. And then we've got a couple of benches and boom, Bob's your uncle. Get that saved up, add a little bit of blue flooring to make it look more icy and a little bit magical in a way, especially around trees because they would block a lot of the snowfall. And that's what's going to make a nice, beautiful map for you. Alright, so now we're looking at the final section of this map, and as you can see, we've got the nice frozen northwest side of the map. Calm entryway into a dangerous underground. There's the trap section to the bottom, there's sort of a puzzly section in the middle, and there's the official way on the north route. All three routes eventually bring you to a similar location, but with different challenges, and each of them that should tick away at health and resources of the party. And in the end, it all leads you to the same place, a fiery ending with a final battle. Thank you guys so much for watching this. I also like to run games, so you can check out some of my one-shots and the fun videos I make in order to recruit people into them. Like and subscribe because the algorithm demands I ask you to do that, and please have yourselves a wonderful day, and remember, the world is not as horrible as the news makes it sound.